Gamescom 2020 is kicked off and we have a few titles to talk about, but one I thought would be of interest is the updated and improved gameplay footage of Ratchet and Clank running on PS5. Like I say though, there was much more at the show that we can discuss in later videos. One of the ones you see right now is certainly one that I was impressed with and I've been watching for the past couple of years on Twitter from the developer himself. But the demo from Ratchet and Clank really reiterates why generations exist and they need to continue. You see, you devalue the expense of moving to next generation in addition to limiting the possibilities of using that new technology. Any brand new hardware cannot be tied to still run on something that is 10-year old from a technology base. Now Ratchet and Clank really shouts next gen in many areas and also shows how much the team have added and improved the technology and design since we saw it back in June. So let's take a mini analysis stroke preview of what this is telling us about next generation games and just how the new hardware is already an enabler for the teams.
What did you
The first thing is, what has improved since last time? Well, we got a good look at how they've improved both the shadows and the reflections since the last showcase. Peter panning has been fixed with the clipping bias issues resolved, so they now align correctly on the planar contacts, likely from improving the depth buffer. You can see an example here on screen. But we have a few other points that cropped up in the older footage. It also cropped up in incorrect reflections. Many objects were missing, or the depth calculation was incorrect. You can see an example here. It looks more like screen space reflections combined with ray tracing. The angle of incident reflection from where the point touches and where the arrow is, you wouldn't see that from the Fresnel level of where the camera's positioned, and it's more accurate on the newer demo. And this is consistent across many of the footage and the ray trace reflections which we see in the later demo here. And these now look more stable across the board. Some of these visible changes come from that improvement to the depth buffer, near or far clipping, and that combination of improved depth. They've also added like a volumetric fog and atmospheric scattering haze, which changes the colour tone and the mapping, so the game looks slightly lighter and brighter in the newer one than the old one. And also they've refined some of the depth of field of the shadows and the lighting effects, so just a little subtle changes there which make the colour tone and the overall presentation look a little different. I'm also noticing that the actual loads to the next section of the game look ever so slightly slower, but they're trying to transition them with a smoother blend into those sequences. You can see this final piece here where they've also moved the light source around now. It used to be at the front facing at the camera, and now it's more behind to the left hand side facing forward, and you can see that with less shadows, a brighter view, and again that's for gameplay reasons. You can see what you're shooting at better, where on the older demo it looks darker and there's less light hitting the object. Any other changes seem pretty minor between the two. Some subtle changes to lighting tones, colour mapping, and again you can see some of the materials better because of the movement in lighting. In the cutscene, some of the reflections for Crank look a little better than they did on the previous one, but overall the biggest improvement is the fact that there's more objects now reflected. So in the original demo, you saw some of these barriers were missing and the stochastic reflections were not as good. Now they're there. They're still not sampling everything, so that's just obviously a performance saving. It makes sense. So when you break things up, like the chair, the debris doesn't get sampled, the alpha effects don't get sampled, and that's because it's triangle based ray tracing. So unless it's a member of that BVH geometry grid, then you simply won't get it. So that means alphas, particles, some of the breaking down debris, they're going to cut those out of the reflections because it just saves on the performance. But by and large, other than this, it's the same as it was back then. So let's dig into some of the stuff we can see now in terms of the quality and what the game offers overall and how it's really using that next generation hardware.
We're back. And not far from where we last saw him.
So like the previous title on the PS4, it's going all out to be a Pixar movie, and that helps by its use of reflections, cube maps, ray traced, and probably even screen space as well. It mixes those up to give a more believable look in characters' eyes, faces, everything reflects everything, and this helps improve the PBR based materials because everything looks more realistic. Metallic surfaces, objects, emissive surfaces, they all reflect, as you can see on the ship here, far more accurately. Freeze framing it, you can see the resolution. Now the game runs at an native 4K, so that's 3840 by 2160. Now this mode runs at 30 FPS, but there is a 60 FPS mode that the Insomniac team have confirmed already, but this will run at a lower resolution, possibly dynamic, maybe ray trace still in there, I don't know, but certainly this mode is 4K, and all the ray trace reflections are likely going to be at a lower resolution because that makes obvious sense, and they're also going to be at a lower level of geometry. That's always been the case, even when I covered back with the Quake 2 RTX demo, or the update that used ray tracing. That was also a much lower quality LOD. That's just standard. Moving into the game, you can see the great combination of shadow maps, reflections, particles, destruction, physics, loads of light cast sources, and that's one of the things that makes the game look so good, because it's so bright and vibrant all the time. We've got that excellent blend of light and shadow. You can see here as those dual shadows reflect on the surface of the water and then beneath it, and then on top of that you've got that ray trace reflection of the character himself as he goes into the shadow and then back out into the sun, and those combinations look great. You can see here as he moves forward the shadow map just drawing on the left where I've circled it, so they're still using the same kind of rasterization techniques to keep performance as high as possible. We're not moving away, as I said way back a couple of years ago, that ray tracing is not going to replace everything, but the combination they're using here looks excellent. The fact that they've mixed it all up with that level of reflections on floor, and they're not reflecting everything but most of the things that make sense. But one of the biggest advantages of ray trace reflections is the fact that you can reflect things that are not on screen, and even characters self-reflecting on themselves. Effectively non-planar reflections, and that's the most impressive part, and that's where it really stands out. And you can see great examples of it here as I zoom in with the character here, the enemy, reflecting on his own gun, and the background as he moves and dances, you can see himself reflecting. You can see that Ratchet reflects in Crank's head on his back, and obviously he self-reflects his own body, which we've covered in the previous video. And then on the enemy here, as he's dancing around, you can see the light bounce from his purple body on the bottom of his metallic chin, but you can see his own reflection of his head, and as he touches the gun his hand reflects on the objects, and again you can see him reflecting in the background objects, and everything reflects upon itself. And all of this just adds believability and solidity to both the world, the materials, and that level of PBR. This is really edging closer and closer to that Pixar DreamWorks levels of real-time animation in video games, and it makes materials and lighting look so much more impressive. And this is much better than just having a standard reflection that could have been screen space but it's now ray traced, and that's what the floor generally is. These reflections in my opinion look much better, and I'm hoping to see more and more of these as the gameplay pans out. Obviously there's a loads more in this, but basically if I keep talking about screen space and ray trace reflections, the video's not going to move on to anything else.
Was that supposed to happen? Hitting Nefarious' device seems to have destabilized reality. The bridge is shot! There has to be another way across!
So the next big leap here on the PS5 is that input-output system, the complete I/O subsystem that's built into the overall console on-chip part of the SoC. So that enables it to page address data from the SSD instantly straight into GPU, straight into CPU, and use it in RAM as it needs to. It doesn't need to be in RAM, but it can address it and pull it in. That combined with the cache use of the GPU scrubbers, and how close and managed they are in terms of that coherency engine and managing that addressable space, means that it's got access to however much they've allocated as a pageable address space on the SSD at around 9 gigabytes per second at the moment, and that opens up a great depth of possibilities, and it gives this ability to constantly stream data at all times. But more importantly, this doesn't come at the cost of the CPU and even the GPU, because all of this is offloaded on secondary co-processors that are part of the SoC itself. So they handle that paging, that loading, the check-in, the decompression, along with everything else. So it means all of this can happen seamlessly and without impact to the game and the console, rendering everything else going on. It just requests the call at a virtual page and waits for that data to be ready as the frame is drawn, and you just manage that as you need it, basically a soft page fold. Not only in just warping yourself forward or in warping through to different worlds, but if you watch when things change, actual objects, geometry, they can warp around you as you're mid-battle with everything else going on. So the fact that it can use all of that data that's not all in RAM at one time means they're maximizing the amount of throughput throughout. But if you look at the quality of how it warps, just there where objects are completely changed from where they were straight in to a cooked chicken by the looks of things, then they're all happening as part of that warp gate. As the rift comes in, it warps through the level and changes objects, geometry, and overall characters instantly as it phases through the screen. And this is done consistently throughout the demo. So they're not only using the hard drive and the I/O streaming just to get through different parts of the level, but they're also using it to dynamically change the construction and the layout of the level, including the enemies. And the fact the most obvious one is that it can just warp between levels instantly by falling through rifts, getting sucked through rifts, or just warping through the level. And this is all part and parcel of that internal SSD and I/O that it really adds. And I'm impressed by the fluidity of how they're using it here. So early on in the generation, it just really bodes well for how well they'll push this further in the first-party games. And I'm sure third-party games with the API construction will start to use this much better, and it will have benefits over than just streaming data in. Addressable space will help. Now, the texture quality, the material quality, the lighting quality is also a very, very high point. But Insomniac are always impressive, and Ratchet & Clank has always been an impressive looking title. They use noise maps, they use different levels of materials for that stochastic reflection, so you can see gold surfaces, metal surfaces. Some of those noise, they're distorted, they're dithered, it's smoothed out, it gives like a rough edge. It's physically based. A lot of the objects are all physically based, and those levels of subsurface microfacets, the concrete posts, all the parquet flooring, the other areas of metal, they all stand out and look sufficiently different, and all of this makes the game look impressive throughout. Adding all that level of destruction, the explosions, and just the sheer amount of chaos that is going on with all of these ray trace reflections, all of the dynamic action, 4K resolutions, and those seamless world warping into the next level just makes this what will be an incredibly impressive next generation title. And even if you don't like the title and you don't like Ratchet and Clank, you cannot argue that this is next generation. There's so many things here that you could not do on anything else at the moment. And even though I'm not trying to start wars, this will affect the PC space, because if you don't have an SSD, or you don't have an SSD of this level, and teams start using this kind of throughput, this is going to have an effect. And the fact that consoles now both have ray tracing options, and we're seeing such good examples of it here so early on, just really bodes well for how well they can mix those together when they start using it for GI bounce, reflection, shadows, and anything else that the team can come up with. There's definitely gameplay advantages available when you've got ray trace as an option, and that SSD, that really opens up loads of possibilities. Anyway, this was a quick look at Ratchet and Clank. I hope you enjoyed it. There's lots more that I could discuss and cover. There's lots more reflections and effects in this title, but I'm going to leave that for when the game launches on PS5. And if you want to check back then on how the console looks, how impressive it's going to be, and all the other launch games and more to come, then please subscribe to the channel. I'm completely self-funded and independent, so anything you guys and girls can do to keep my numbers up and improve my reach is both beneficial and appreciated. Anyway, I'm out, but I'll catch you on the next one.
What?